The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Lane when the first scream pierced the suburban quiet. Karen Mullins had her service weapon drawn, barrel pointed directly at 12-year-old Marcus Johnson's chest, her voice cutting through the air like broken glass. "Drop it now! Put your hands where I can see them!" The pink cake box trembled in Marcus's grip, vanilla frosting visible through the clear plastic window. His round face frozen in terror as neighbors began emerging from their manicured lawns and pristine driveways. Marcus had been walking this same route every Saturday for 3 months, delivering homemade treats his grandmother baked for the monthly charity fundraiser. Today's destination was the community center, where the Willowbrook Foster Care Initiative held their bake sale, raising money for children aging out of the system. The boy's backpack bulged with additional containers, each holding carefully crafted cupcakes, cookies, and petit fours that his grandmother Martha had spent 2 days preparing. His white t-shirt stretched tight across his middle, evidence of too many taste tests during the baking process. But his smile had been genuine, as he'd set out that morning with $23 in donations already tucked safely in his pocket. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association had hired Karen 6 months earlier as their first official security officer, complete with uniform, badge, and carry permit that she wore like armor against a world she viewed with increasing suspicion. Her patrol route covered 12 blocks of identical colonial houses, each with regulation mailboxes and HOA-approved lawn ornaments, where the most serious infractions typically involved garbage cans left out past collection day or unauthorized garden gnomes. But Karen saw threats everywhere, filing reports about suspicious joggers, documenting license plates of unfamiliar vehicles, and maintaining a detailed log of any deviation from neighborhood normalcy. She'd been sitting in her patrol car, engine running, air conditioning battling the late September heat, when she spotted Marcus making his way down the sidewalk. Something about his appearance triggered her internal alarm system. The boy was walking slowly, deliberately, his backpack sagging with weight. His clothes looked rumpled, and she noted how he kept checking his phone, glancing around nervously. In Karen's mind, these weren't the actions of an innocent child on an errand. These were the calculated movements of someone up to no good. "Excuse me," Karen called out, rolling down her window as she pulled alongside him. "What's your business in this neighborhood?" Marcus looked up, startled, clutching the cake box tighter to his chest. "I'm delivering cakes to the community center, ma'am, for the foster kids fundraiser." His voice carried the polite deference his grandmother had drilled into him. But Karen heard something else entirely. Rehearsed, suspicious. Exactly what someone would say if they were trying to hide their real intentions. She parked the car and stepped out, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her weapon's grip. Karen stood 5'10" in her regulation boots, her HOA uniform pressed to military precision, silver badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "You don't live around here. I know every family in this development." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his backpack pulling at his shoulders. "My grandma lives on Maple Street. I help her with the baking every weekend." But Karen wasn't listening to his explanation. She was studying his body language, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, how his free hand kept fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "What's really in that bag?" Her tone had shifted, becoming harder, more accusatory. "Open it. Now." Marcus's eyes widened, confusion replacing the initial nervousness. "It's just cupcakes and cookies. I promise. Mrs. Patterson at the community center is expecting them by 3 o'clock." He started to swing the backpack around to show her, but Karen's training kicked in. Sudden movements, reaching for concealed items, potential weapon access. Her hand closed around the grip of her pistol. "Don't move. Keep your hands visible." The command came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying across the quiet street and drawing the attention of Mrs. Chen, who was watering her prized rose garden 3 houses down. Marcus froze completely, the cake box still pressed against his chest, his backpack halfway off his shoulder. I don't understand. I'm just delivering cakes." His voice cracked on the last word, the reality of the situation beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood check. This was something far more serious. Karen's mind raced through her training scenarios, connecting dots that existed only in her imagination. Overweight kid, bulky clothing, nervous behavior, unusual items. Pattern recognition told her this was a textbook case of juvenile theft in progress. She'd read about it in her security forums. Kids using sympathy and innocent appearances to case neighborhoods, steal packages, maybe even deal drugs. The cake box could be a cover story. The backpack could contain stolen goods, or worse. "I'm going to need to search that bag and verify your story," Karen announced, her voice carrying the authority she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror. "If you're really just delivering baked goods, you won't mind proving it." Marcus nodded eagerly, relief flooding his features. "Yes, ma'am. Of course. Grandma Martha always puts labels on everything. She even wrote out the ingredients because some kids have allergies." He began to lower the backpack to the ground, moving slowly to avoid startling her further. But as he bent forward to unzip the main compartment, Karen's paranoia spiked again. What if he was reaching for a weapon? What if this whole innocent act was just that? An act. She'd heard stories about kids being used as drug runners, about juvenile criminals getting more sophisticated every year. Her pulse quickened as she watched his pudgy fingers work at the zipper. And suddenly, she was remembering every cautionary tale from her training, every horror story from the security forums, every worst-case scenario her mind could conjure. "Step away from the bag, hands up. Now." The words exploded from her throat as her weapon cleared its holster in one smooth motion. The afternoon sun glinted off the metal. And suddenly, the peaceful suburban street transformed into something from a nightmare. Marcus stumbled backward, his hands shooting skyward, the cake box tumbling to the sidewalk where it landed with a sickening squelch. Pink frosting and cake crumbs scattered across the concrete like evidence at a crime scene. The first neighbor to react was Tom Bradley, a retired police officer who'd been washing his car in his driveway. He dropped his sponge and started moving toward the commotion, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation. Behind him, his wife Janet was already on the phone, but whether she was calling 911 or someone else wasn't immediately clear. Across the street, Maria Santos clutched her toddler closer to her chest and backed toward her front door, while old Mr. Peterson emerged from his garage with a baseball bat, unsure which side of the confrontation posed the real threat. "Please don't shoot me," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "I was just bringing cakes to the fundraiser. My grandma is Martha Johnson. She lives at 247 Maple Street. You can call her. Please." Tears were starting to form in the corners of his eyes, but he didn't dare move to wipe them away. The weapon pointed at his chest looked enormous, its barrel like a dark tunnel leading to the end of everything he'd ever known. Karen felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes confrontations, the same rush she'd experienced during her brief stint as a mall security guard before landing this HOA position. Every fiber of her being screamed that she was dealing with a dangerous situation, that her instincts were right, that this overweight kid with his suspicious story and nervous behavior was exactly the kind of threat she'd been hired to neutralize. "Save it for the real cops," she snapped, keeping the weapon trained on his center mass. "We'll see what they make of your story." The irony was lost on Karen that she'd already become the real story. Tom Bradley had reached the edge of his property line and was shouting something, but she couldn't make out the words over the blood rushing in her ears. More neighbors were emerging, some with phones raised to record the scene, others calling out questions and demands for information. The quiet Saturday afternoon was transforming into a full-scale neighborhood incident. With Karen and Marcus at the epicenter of a drama neither of them had anticipated when they'd woken up that morning. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" Tom's voice cut through the chaos as he approached with his hands visible. Using the tone he'd perfected during 25 years of patrol work, "Put the weapon down and talk to me. What's the situation here?" But Karen was operating on pure instinct now, her training taking over in ways that her instructors never could have intended. She'd found a potential threat, neutralized it, and now she needed to maintain control until backup arrived. "Stay back, Tom. This kid is up to something. Look at him. Look at all that stuff he's carrying. Since when do kids just wander around neighborhoods with backpacks full of who knows what?" Her logic seemed ironclad to her in that moment, each detail confirming her suspicions rather than challenging them. The destroyed cake on the sidewalk could have been a cover story. The tears streaming down Marcus's face could have been an act. The fact that she didn't recognize him meant he didn't belong. And people who didn't belong were inherently suspicious. Marcus's grandmother, Martha, had been expecting him home by 4 o'clock, after he dropped off the baked goods and helped set up tables for the evening's fundraiser. She'd spent the morning putting finishing touches on her famous lemon bars, the same recipe she'd used when Marcus's father was his age, before the accident that left the boy in her care. At 73, Martha Johnson had raised 2 generations of children, and she understood better than most that sometimes the world could be dangerous for young black boys, even in neighborhoods that prided themselves on their safety and inclusivity. She'd given Marcus the same talk she'd given his father decades earlier, about keeping his hands visible, about being polite to authority figures, about never making sudden movements or raising his voice. But none of that wisdom seemed relevant now as he stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring down the barrel of a weapon held by someone who should have been protecting him rather than threatening him. The institutional knowledge passed down through generations of careful survival suddenly felt inadequate against the reality of a split-second decision by someone who saw threat where others saw childhood. The sound of approaching sirens began to filter through the neighborhood's usual Saturday afternoon quiet, growing louder with each passing second. Someone had called 911, though it wasn't clear whether they'd reported an armed robbery in progress or an HOA officer threatening a child. The distinction would matter enormously in how the responding officers approached the scene, what assumptions they made about who represented danger and who needed protection. "Karen, listen to me." Tom tried again, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I know this kid. He delivers baked goods for the community center fundraiser every month. His grandmother Martha makes the best apple turnovers in the county. You need to lower your weapon right now before this gets any worse." But Karen was beyond the reach of reason, her worldview crystallizing around the narrative she'd constructed. Any information that contradicted her assessment of the threat was simply further evidence of how sophisticated the deception had become. "That's exactly what they want you to think," she shouted back, sweat beading on her forehead despite the moderate temperature. "These operations are getting more clever every year. They use kids because people like you won't suspect them. But I see through it. I see what's really happening here." The sirens were getting closer now, and Marcus could hear multiple units responding, their overlapping wails creating a symphony of approaching authority that should have felt like rescue, but somehow made everything more terrifying. In the community center, 6 blocks away, Eleanor Patterson was checking her watch and wondering where Marcus had gotten to. As the coordinator for the Foster Care Initiative's monthly fundraiser, she'd come to depend on Martha Johnson's contributions and her grandson's reliable delivery service. The boy was never late, always polite, and often stayed to help arrange the display tables and chat with the volunteers about the kids they were raising money to support. Eleanor didn't know that she was about to become a key figure in a neighborhood drama that would make headlines across the state. She didn't know that her fundraiser was being used as justification for what was rapidly becoming a dangerous confrontation. She was simply a retired teacher who dedicated her post-career years to helping children who'd aged out of foster care. Children who often found themselves alone in the world at 18, with nowhere to turn and no safety net to catch them when they fell. The first police cruiser rounded the corner onto Willowbrook Lane, just as Karen was shouting new demands at Marcus, ordering him to lie face down on the sidewalk while she maintained her firing position. The responding officers, Sergeant Michelle Torres and Officer David Kim, immediately recognized the complexity of the scene they were approaching. An armed woman in what appeared to be a security uniform, a young boy with his hands raised, a growing crowd of neighbors, and enough tension in the air to cut with a knife. Torres had 18 years of experience and a reputation for de-escalating exactly these kinds of situations. She'd seen enough real threats to recognize the difference between genuine danger and manufactured crisis. And everything about this scene suggested the latter. The boy's posture, the neighbor's body language, the fact that Tom Bradley was trying to mediate rather than seeking cover, all pointed toward a situation that had spiraled far beyond its original scope. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your weapon immediately," Torres called out as she exited her vehicle, her own sidearm still holstered, but her hand resting on its grip. "Let's talk about what's happening here." Karen felt a moment of validation as the real police arrived. Finally, professionals who would understand the seriousness of the situation, who would see what she'd seen, who would back up her assessment and take the suspect into custody. "Thank God you're here," Karen called back without taking her eyes off Marcus. "I've got a suspicious individual with unknown contents in his backpack. He claims he's delivering baked goods, but the story doesn't add up. I've detained him pending your arrival." Her voice carried the authority she'd been practicing, the professional tone she'd adopted from watching police procedurals and reading security manuals. But Officer Kim was looking at the scene with fresh eyes, noting details that Karen's tunnel vision had obscured. The destroyed cake on the sidewalk, obviously homemade, and clearly marked with a label reading, "For Foster Care Fundraiser." The boy's backpack, which had spilled open slightly during the confrontation, revealing containers clearly marked with ingredients lists and Martha's Kitchen labels. The neighbors' reactions, which suggested protectiveness toward the child, rather than fear of him. "Son, are you hurt?" Torres called out to Marcus, her voice carrying the kind of practiced calm that comes from years of dealing with traumatized victims. "Can you tell me your name and what you were doing here today?" Marcus tried to answer, but his voice came out as little more than a squeak. The adrenaline and fear had left him shaking so hard he could barely form words, let alone explain the simple errand that had somehow transformed into the most terrifying experience of his young life. "Marcus Johnson." He finally managed to whisper, "I was bringing cakes to Mrs. Patterson at the community center. For the foster kids. My grandma made them. She makes them every month." His words were punctuated by hitching breaths and the occasional sob. But the officers heard enough to understand that they were dealing with exactly what it appeared to be: a child on an innocent errand who'd been terrorized by an overzealous security officer. Torres made eye contact with her partner, and they shared the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together. This wasn't a criminal apprehension. This was a civil rights violation in progress. Possibly assault with a deadly weapon. Definitely a situation that required immediate intervention to prevent it from escalating further. The security officer's behavior had crossed so many lines that the real question wasn't whether charges would be filed, but how many and how serious they would be. "Ma'am, I need you to holster your weapon right now," Torres said, her tone shifting from negotiation to command. "This is not a lawful detention, and you do not have authority to hold this child at gunpoint." But Karen's worldview was too invested in her version of events to accept this new information. If the police weren't immediately supporting her actions, it meant they didn't understand the full scope of the threat she'd identified. "You don't understand." Karen's voice took on a desperate edge as she realized the situation was slipping away from her control. "This whole setup is too convenient. A kid with a backpack full of containers, claiming he's making deliveries. Look at him. Does he look like someone who should be trusted with community access?" The ugly undertone of her words hung in the air like smoke, revealing prejudices that had been simmering beneath the surface of her professional demeanor. That's when Eleanor Patterson arrived, having finally decided to investigate Marcus's unusual absence herself. She'd driven the 6 blocks from the community center with growing concern, never imagining she'd find the boy held at gunpoint by a neighborhood security officer who seemed to have lost all connection to reality. Eleanor was 78 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years managing classrooms full of teenagers. "What in God's name is going on here?" Eleanor demanded as she climbed out of her Honda Civic, her cane tapping against the asphalt as she approached the scene. "Marcus, honey, are you all right?" She took in the destroyed cake, the terrified boy, the armed woman in the security uniform, and the responding police officers. And her teacher's instincts immediately identified the power dynamics at play. "Ma'am, please stay back," Officer Kim called out. But Eleanor Patterson had spent decades dealing with situations where adults failed children, and she wasn't about to be deterred by protocol when a child was in danger. "That's Marcus Johnson, and he's been delivering baked goods for our foster care fundraiser every month for the past year. His grandmother, Martha, makes the most beautiful cakes you've ever seen. And this boy has never been anything but polite and helpful." Karen's certainty began to crack as this new witness provided corroboration for Marcus's story. But her pride and her commitment to her narrative made it impossible to simply back down. "Anyone can claim to know him," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "That doesn't prove he wasn't up to something else today. People change. Kids get recruited for all kinds of things." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos with the kind of deliberate precision that comes with age and determination. "Here's Marcus helping us set up tables last month. Here he is with the cupcakes his grandmother made for our Easter fundraiser. Here's a thank you card he wrote to the donors." She held up the phone so the officers could see the evidence of Marcus's legitimate connection to the community center and its activities. But the real game-changer came when Eleanor pulled out a manila folder from her car's passenger seat. "And here's his receipt for today's delivery. $23 in pre-orders from neighbors who specifically requested Martha's lemon bars and chocolate cupcakes. I've got names, addresses, and payment records going back 6 months." She handed the documentation to Sergeant Torres, who began reviewing the meticulous records that Eleanor maintained for tax purposes and grant applications. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Marcus wasn't a random kid with a suspicious story. He was a documented volunteer with a paper trail of community service and a grandmother whose baking skills were apparently legendary in the neighborhood. Eleanor's records showed patterns of regular deliveries, satisfied customers, and a fundraising operation that had raised over $3,000 for foster care support programs over the past year alone. "Ma'am, holster your weapon immediately," Torres commanded, her patience finally exhausted. "You are illegally detaining a minor, and if you don't comply right now, you're going to be under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, and violation of civil rights." The legal terminology hit Karen like cold water, finally penetrating the fog of adrenaline and self-righteousness that had driven her actions. For a moment, The entire street held its breath. Karen looked around at the faces surrounding her. Neighbors she'd been hired to protect. Police officers she'd expected to support her. An elderly woman with documentation that made her look like either an elaborate criminal mastermind or exactly what she claimed to be, a community volunteer. The reality of her situation began to penetrate her consciousness, like sunlight through clouds, revealing a landscape entirely different from what she'd imagined. I was just doing my job," Karen said weakly as she slowly lowered the weapon, her hands shaking as the magnitude of her mistake became clear. "I thought—" He looked suspicious. The backpack, the way he was acting. But even as she spoke, she could hear how thin her justification sounded when measured against the evidence of Marcus's innocence and her own catastrophic overreaction. Marcus collapsed to his knees as soon as the weapon was no longer pointed at him, great gasping sobs racking his body as the terror he'd been holding back finally found its release. Eleanor was beside him in seconds, her arms around his shoulders, murmuring the kind of reassurances that teachers learn to offer traumatized children. "You're safe now. Honey, you didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault." Officer Kim was already calling for additional units and an ambulance to check Marcus for signs of shock or other stress-related medical issues. Torres was reading Karen her rights while securing her weapon as evidence. The neighborhood had transformed from a quiet suburban street into an active crime scene, with the roles of victim and perpetrator now clearly established in ways that Karen was still struggling to process. But the day's revelations weren't finished. As Torres was placing Karen in handcuffs, Tom Bradley approached with his own phone in hand. "Sergeant, I think you need to see this," he said grimly. "I've been recording since this started, and I caught the whole thing. But there's something else. I've been documenting Karen's behavior for weeks. This isn't the first time she's harassed people in the neighborhood." Tom's phone contained not just the afternoon's confrontation, but a pattern of increasingly aggressive behavior toward anyone Karen deemed suspicious. A delivery driver questioned about his right to be in the neighborhood. A teenage girl searched because her clothes looked too expensive for someone walking rather than driving. An elderly man detained because he was collecting cans from recycling bins. Never mind that it was his own recycling from his own house. "She's been escalating for months," Tom explained to the officers, "making up reasons to confront people, filing false reports, claiming authority she doesn't have. I started recording because I knew eventually she was going to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I just never thought it would be this bad." His documentation revealed a pattern of behavior that transformed the day's incident from an isolated mistake into evidence of systematic harassment and civil rights violations. Eleanor had helped Marcus to his feet and was walking him toward her car when she turned back to address the gathered crowd. "This boy has been nothing but a blessing to our community. Every month, he and his grandmother donate time, effort, and ingredients to help children who have no family support. While some people were looking for problems that didn't exist, Marcus was actually solving problems that do exist." Her words carried across the street to neighbors who'd been watching the drama unfold, many of whom were now remembering their own interactions with Marcus over the months. Mrs. Chen recalled how he'd helped her carry groceries when her arthritis was acting up. The Santos family remembered how he'd returned their escaped cat, refusing the reward money they'd offered. Mr. Peterson realized that the boy he'd seen collecting litter from the storm drains was the same one now being comforted by Eleanor Patterson. As Karen was being placed in the back of a police cruiser, her mind was finally beginning to process the full scope of her mistakes. The innocent child she'd terrorized, the community trust she'd destroyed, the career she'd ended with her paranoia and prejudice, the legal consequences that would follow from this moment for years to come, the reality that she'd become exactly the kind of person she'd thought she was protecting the neighborhood from. Marcus's grandmother Martha arrived just as the ambulance was finishing its assessment of her grandson. She'd been worried when he didn't return home at his usual time. Then, terrified when neighbors started calling with fragments of information about police cars and confrontations. Seeing Marcus safe but shaken, surrounded by community members offering support and protection, brought tears to her eyes for reasons both grateful and furious. "My baby," she whispered as she pulled Marcus into her arms, feeling how his body still trembled from the trauma he'd endured. "I'm so sorry this happened to you. You were just trying to help, just like I taught you." But even as she comforted her grandson, Martha's mind was already turning to the legal and political implications of what had occurred. A child threatened with deadly force for delivering charity-baked goods was exactly the kind of story that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook Lane. The crowd was beginning to disperse as the immediate crisis resolved itself, but the conversations continued in driveways and living rooms throughout the neighborhood. How had they allowed someone like Karen to be hired as their security officer? What oversight had been lacking? What other incidents had they missed or dismissed? The comfortable assumption that their neighborhood was safe and well-managed had been shattered by the revelation that their security had become their biggest threat. Eleanor Patterson made sure that Marcus and Martha had her contact information and a firm commitment that the foster care fundraiser would continue as planned, though perhaps with additional security measures to prevent future incidents. She also made it clear that she intended to pursue every legal avenue available to ensure that Marcus received justice and that similar incidents were prevented in the future. "This isn't just about one bad security officer," Eleanor told the gathered neighbors. "This is about a system that allowed prejudice and paranoia to masquerade as community protection. We need to examine not just what happened today, but how we allowed it to get to this point." Her words carried the weight of decades spent advocating for children who had no other advocates, and her determination to see justice done was unmistakable. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Karen's misconduct became clear through investigations by both the police and the Homeowners Association. Her employment was terminated immediately, her security license revoked permanently, and criminal charges filed for assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, and civil rights violations. The lawsuit filed by Marcus's family, supported by Eleanor Patterson's meticulous documentation, resulted in a settlement that would fund his college education and provide compensation for the trauma he'd endured. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association faced its own reckoning, with state authorities launching an investigation into their hiring practices and oversight procedures. The board was replaced entirely in a special election, with new leadership committed to transparency and community accountability. The incident sparked statewide reform of HOA security regulations, requiring background checks, ongoing training, and citizen oversight committees for any private security operations in residential communities. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from the neighborhood itself. The monthly foster care fundraiser grew into a community-wide event, with neighbors who'd been strangers before coming together to support Eleanor Patterson's work. Marcus continued his deliveries, but now he was accompanied by rotating volunteers who'd decided that community protection meant protecting all community members, especially the most vulnerable. Martha Johnson's baking became legendary, not just for its quality, but for its symbolism. Every cake, every batch of cookies, every carefully labeled container represented the kind of community service that actually made neighborhoods safer, stronger, and more connected. The contrast between Marcus's constructive contributions and Karen's destructive paranoia became a teaching moment that the community embraced and learned from. 6 months after the incident, Marcus stood at the podium in the same community center where Eleanor Patterson had been waiting for him that terrible Saturday afternoon. He was receiving a Community Service Award, not just for his work with the foster care fundraiser, but for his courage in the face of injustice and his continued commitment to helping others despite the trauma he'd experienced. "I was scared that day," Marcus told the packed room, his voice stronger now, though still carrying the gentle politeness his grandmother had taught him. "But I learned that being scared doesn't mean you stop trying to help people. It means you find better ways to help, with more people supporting you." His words brought tears to many eyes, especially Eleanor Patterson's, who sat in the front row, beaming with pride at the young man he was becoming. The audience included Tom Bradley, who'd become something of a local hero for his documentation of Karen's pattern of abuse, Mrs. Chen and the Santos family, who'd learned that true community safety came from knowing and supporting your neighbors, not from suspecting and surveilling them. Even former HOA board members who'd recognized their role in enabling Karen's behavior and were working to make amends through volunteer service and policy reform. Karen Mullins had pled guilty to reduced charges and received probation, community service, and mandatory counseling for bias-related offenses. She'd been required to write a public apology that was published in the local newspaper. Though words seemed inadequate to address the harm she'd caused, her life had been permanently altered by 30 minutes of poor judgment, driven by prejudice and paranoia. While Marcus's life had been transformed by the community's response to that injustice, the foster care fundraiser had exceeded all previous records, raising enough money to establish a permanent scholarship fund for children aging out of the system. Eleanor Patterson had received state recognition for her advocacy work, and Martha Johnson's recipes had been compiled into a cookbook whose proceeds continued to support the cause. What had begun as a routine Saturday afternoon delivery had evolved into a movement that touched hundreds of lives across the region. As Marcus concluded his speech and the audience rose in sustained applause, the true measure of justice became clear. It wasn't just that Karen had faced consequences for her actions, though that was important. It wasn't just that the systems that had enabled her behavior had been reformed, though that was necessary. The real justice was in the transformation of a community that had learned to see strength in vulnerability, safety in inclusion, and protection in mutual support rather than mutual suspicion. The afternoon sun streamed through the community center windows, casting warm light on faces that reflected hope, determination, and renewed faith in the possibility that people could learn from their worst moments and build something better. Marcus Johnson, still 12 years old, but somehow older than his years, had become a symbol not just of innocence threatened, but of resilience triumphant and community healing. Outside in the parking lot, Tom Bradley was helping Eleanor Patterson load leftover baked goods into her Honda Civic when she paused to look back at the community center. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think this turned out to be the most important fundraiser we've ever had, not because of the money we raised, but because of what we learned about ourselves and each other." Tom nodded, understanding that sometimes the worst moments reveal the best possibilities, and that justice isn't just about punishment, but about transformation. The story of Marcus Johnson and the cake that nearly cost him his life became a touchstone for discussions about community safety, racial justice, and the responsibility that comes with authority. But for those who lived it, the real lesson was simpler and more profound: that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep doing good work even when the world seems dangerous. And that true security comes not from keeping others out, but from bringing everyone in. As the sun set over Willowbrook Lane that evening, children played on sidewalks where a child had once feared for his life. Neighbors chatted across property lines that had once felt like battlegrounds. And Martha Johnson put the finishing touches on a fresh batch of cookies for the next day's deliveries. The cake had been destroyed, but the community it represented had been reborn, stronger and sweeter than before.